Greetings, my wonderful students. Today we begin our study of communist China after World War II. After the Japanese were defeated, China continued its civil war. If you recall, before the Japanese invaded China, the Kuomintang, the nationalists, were fighting against Mao Zedong and his communists. After the Japanese were defeated, the civil war in China continued. And in 1949, Chiang Kai-shek, leader of the Kuomintang, fled to Taiwan along with his top people, and Mao Zedong and the communists took control of China, and they renamed the country the People's Republic of China. You'll see that a lot in many communist countries. They'll call themselves the People's Republic. North Korea, another communist country, is known as the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Now, Mao's policies. In 1953, Mao Zedong adopted the Soviet model of 5-year plans for the economy. The first Chinese 5-year plan stressed rapid industrialization and land reform along the same lines that the Soviets had. Production increased greatly in the first 5-year plan. In 1958, Mao's second 5-year plan was called the Great Leap Forward. It was designed to be even more ambitious than the original. However, it was a failure due to poor planning and was abandoned in the 1960s. I cannot stress enough how bad the Great Leap Forward was. The process of collectivization, just like they had done in the Soviet Union, had created a huge famine. And of course, with China having more people than any other country in the world, this was especially bad. It is estimated that up to 50 million people died in this famine. 50 million Chinese people died in this famine. Now, lower estimates put it in the 18 to 20 million, but 18 to 20 million as a low estimate is still a large number of people when you really think about it. So, this was a major failure on the part of the Chinese Communist Party, which leads us to the Cultural Revolution. Mao blamed the failure of the Great Leap Forward on anti-communist sentiment in China. What he claimed was that there were people who were actively sabotaging the Chinese Communist Party. So he chose students, college students and high school students, to join a new organization that he wanted to create called the Red Guard. It would guard the Red or Communist Revolution. And Mao wanted to use this Red Guard to destroy the old Chinese culture and create a new communist culture. He said the only way for communism to succeed is to have a constant, perpetual, revolutionary spirit. And he saw this Red Guard as a way to do that, and so they destroyed artifacts, they destroyed vases, they destroyed histories in their country, all in an attempt to destroy the old and create this new communist culture. And in this picture, they're waving these books. Now, you can't tell because it's a black and white picture, but these books are red books, and they are books of quotations from Mao Zedong. It's quotations of Chairman Mao. He was chairman of the Communist Party and pretty much dictator of China. And they were expected to have these and read these and be able to quote from this book. It was definitely a very interesting time in Chinese history. The Red Guard, with the sanction of Mao Zedong, went on a rampage. They vandalized buildings. They attacked people who they claimed had abandoned communism. So you're seeing physically attacking people and vandalizing their own history and their own historical, whether it was statues or signs. They're trying to destroy their old culture. Now, as a result, the country fell into chaos, and agricultural and industrial production fell even more. And in 1969, Mao called an end to the Cultural Revolution, as it was basically really holding China back. Now, at first, the United States refused relations with communist China. Remember, our policy was containment. We wanted to stop the spread of communism. And obviously, while we weren't going to invade China to do that, we certainly didn't want to have relations with a major communist country at that point. And instead, we saw Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang, who had fled to Taiwan at this point, to be the real Chinese government. But as years passed, it became more and more obvious that the Kuomintang was not going to come back into China and not going to overthrow the communist dictatorship that had formed. So we had some issues. Now, relations between China and the Soviet Union deteriorated. the Soviet Union pretty much wanted to control all of the communist countries. We saw that in our study of the Cold War, in which the Soviet Union had sent troops into Czechoslovakia, they'd sent troops into Hungary, they'd sent tanks into East Germany, all to keep their people in charge. The Soviet Union effectively controlled the communist countries of Eastern Europe, and China didn't want to be controlled by the Soviet Union. And so relations between China and the Soviet Union deteriorated, and President Nixon, as you see here in this picture, wanted to become more friendly with China. His statement later on was that he hoped to drive a wedge between the two largest communist countries. And in that vein, Nixon visited China to improve relations and open trade with China. Now, in 1976, Mao Zedong died, and his wife and her supporters tried to gain control of China. They were known together as the Gang of Four, but they failed. Remember, in our country, when the president dies, the vice president comes in charge. And of course, more often than not, what happens is the president is elected to 1 term or 2 terms and then is succeeded by a different president. But in a dictatorship situation, the dictator usually lives until they're overthrown or they die, which is what had happened here, which means that there's no clear-cut path for who's going to become the next dictator, and there's a power struggle, and this is what happened here. So instead, this man, Deng Xiaoping, became the leader of China, and he favored economic reforms such as his 4 modernizations. Now, he's still a dictator, but he's looking at the Chinese economy and saying, we have to do better than this. So part of his 4 modernizations was to actually make the economy less communist. And if you recall, that's also what Gorbachev did in Russia in an attempt to make the Soviet economy better. So as part of the 4 modernizations, Deng Xiaoping decreased government interference in the economy, encouraged trade with foreign countries, and encouraged investment by foreigners. And the economy began to improve. As you can see here, in the mid-70s, according to this graph, the Chinese economy begins to greatly improve, and it continues its skyrocket. Now, that investment by foreigners, that's one of the reasons why you're going to see all of these products that are made in China today, is because many of these American companies and European companies, other countries' companies, began to move factories into China to take advantage of cheap labor. As they did that, obviously more Chinese people began to get better paying jobs for them. It's definitely they're paid less than American workers or European workers are. But compared to what the Chinese workers were paid before, these are actually very good jobs for them. So China's economy began to grow, their people began to get more money. Which leads us to another issue. New contact with the West, as in Western Europe and the United States, the countries that have the ideas of the Enlightenment, that have freedom and democracy, brought cultural diffusion, which meant new ideas were brought into China. And in April of 1989, students began protesting in Tiananmen Square for more democracy. Now, Tiananmen Square is kind of like a mixture of Times Square in New York City, but also the National Mall in Washington. This is in the capital city. And these students are protesting for more of a say in their country's government. The protest went on until June, and the government eventually sent in tanks and killed thousands of protesters. This is called the Tiananmen Square Massacre. In 1989, the Tiananmen Square Massacre happened. Thousands of students were killed. Now, after Deng Xiaoping died, China was ruled by the Politburo Standing Committee, which is composed of the President of China and other ranking members of the Communist Party. In March of 2018, however, China's constitution was changed to get rid of term limits for the president. See, now Deng Xiaoping had changed the constitution after he had decided to be done being leader and had made it so there would be term limits, so there wouldn't be a single dictator for China. However, in 2018, the constitution was changed again to get rid of term limits. And as of right now, it looks like President Xi Jinping may be president for life. Population. China's population is the largest of any country in the world with over 1.3 billion people. Recognizing there are something like 7 billion people on the planet, that's a large number of people. And in order to keep its population under control, China has instituted a one-child policy. The idea is for each family to have only one child. so that their population would grow at a slower rate and eventually would start to decline. This has created some problems for them. Now, we'll go back, and I want to specifically state not every couple has this. And some of you may be wondering what happens to a couple that does. Well, it depends on the situation, because much of this is enforced at the local level. Think like state governments, only in China. And in some ways, they've given you money if you agree to have one child. And then if you have a second child, then you have to pay all that money back. In other ways, they have kidnapped some women and force them to have abortions against their will and force sterilizations as well. Remember, this is a dictatorship, and human rights are not a high priority for the Chinese government. So what we have here is a graph that shows in 1950 what the population is in China. And you can see from 0 to 4, there's a much larger group that is that population. And you see a very small group between 75 and 79. Now, in the regular classroom version that I have of this changes. Unfortunately, that feature is disabled here, and I don't know how to enable it. But basically, as time passes, you will see this change where instead of it being so few people at the top, it'll actually even out, and there'll be more elderly than there are young people as a result of the one-child policy. And that's going to create economic problems for China as a smaller group of workers in their 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s are trying to support a larger group of people who will end up retired or unable to work in their 70s and 80s and 90s. Now, the policy of the one-child policy was more successful in urban or city areas than rural ones, farm ones. As the population ages, it may create a problem as China struggles to support its elderly. Now, China considers Taiwan, where the Kuomintang had fled, to be part of China. There have been international problems because of this, because the Taiwanese people who are basically they're independent and they don't want to be controlled by the Chinese government. China took control of Tibet, which used to be a theocracy ruled by the Dalai Lama, a Buddhist, took control of Tibet soon after the Communist Revolution, and there continues to be problems there as the Chinese government persecutes the Buddhist people for their religious beliefs. And the island of Hong Kong, you might recall, had been leased to the British after the Opium War, and it was finally returned to Chinese control in 1997. It has maintained a separate economy, even though it's controlled by China. And there were even protests there earlier last year, if any of you were paying attention in the news. So that creates an issue as well. And I hope you enjoyed this particular lessons on China.